a pretty good length here. The exciting, I'm always pointing in the wrong direction. To our dear patrons who help make the show possible every single week and make it way easier to get along in a world where bills have to be paid and life has to be done. So thank you all for holding on to the fort there. As you know, I'm going through the fabulous book of Traced, which is a slimmer operation and actually has a finished bibliography to it, but it's still finding out what the sources are, how they're used in the frame. He spends the next pages from where we left off last episode going on about Africa and the slave trade, which he disapproves of. Isn't that sweet? Without actually delving into the degree to which the slave trade built upon religious convictions that it was okay to do that, both in the Islamic element, which he mentions, and then in the Christian one, which he kind of sidles around very quickly on there. Anyway, not a source in sight for any of that stuff other than the generic book on Islamic slavery. Blacks enslaved by other blacks is what fit into his. Anyway, he then jumps into the next chapter where he begins with a section on Carter's expedition to find King Tut's tomb way back in the 1920s. And all of this was a kind of a roundabout way to bring up Egypt and the Egyptian people and the haplotypes of the Egyptian people, all of which I think his creationist brain is requiring to have something to connect it up, because Egypt plays such a part in the Bible, from wandering in the wilderness. Jesus supposedly zips over there for a while. And then you've also got, of course, Moses and all of that stuff in the Old Testament. So Egypt is kind of a big deal, and he wants to kind of deal with it. But, he doesn't quite deal with that. So bringing up King Tut's tomb is kind of late in the game, because that's a New Kingdom object. That's dating, in fact, from a time that would be around or after the time of the Exodus, not a long time after the Exodus, which, if you're using the traditionalist framework, which presumably Daryl Jensen is, which would be about 1500 BC rather than 1200. But he then along the way decided to name drop the pyramids. And my Egyptologist mind is going, wait a minute. The pyramids are built at a time that's before the flood. Does he notice that? Does he know anything about it? Does he deal with any of that? Maybe he will later on in the book, although I don't think he's got any sources in his reference bibliography that pertain to this kind of issue. So I just think he just lands it and goes. It doesn't occur to him to realize that, yeah, those pyramids are pre-flood. And of course, the creationist mythology requires that they be yanked down. And I don't think Jensen has given enough thought on that subject. Of the 2348 BCE dating. I'll give you a little teaser of a thing that's going to be appearing in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, which has to do with that dating of the flood of 2348, because that's the Bishop Ussher version that's dealt with AIG and ICR, but not everybody in that bunch. And I was quite surprised when I started cataloging all the different dates that people have given to the flood based on biblical calculations. You figure, okay, Adam is born then, and then there's so many 8 days, and then he has kids and blah, 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 and do all that. Because there are 3 main versions of the Bible, the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Masoretic texts. They all come up with different dates. Anyway, there's going to be a big little chart in the new book that catalogs all of that stuff. And if you'll notice down at the bottom, there's the 2348 date, and there's quite a few that date after it. And then quite a few people, quite a lot of people, including the Masoretic text, comes before that. And then if we go farther back in time, we can see that there's even some that go way, 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 way before 2348. Hello, Brian. And of course, there'll be a ton of technical references. This was a little flyer that I had printed up for my little talk with Gillis, which never quite got to the dating of the flood details. But anyway, those are the sources that are documenting the stuff that's in the chart. And my favorite one has to be Brown, who managed to move the flood date a whopping 1,000 years. 2248 down to 3,300. He moved in almost 800 years in the space of a couple years. Same Bible, same stuff. How useful is that? Anyway, finally on page 52, Jensen returns to a kind of technical material, and it relates to a chart that he puts up that talks about the family tree of 600 men. Actually, the paper he's going to allude to is 603. It's based on Bergstrom 2020, and I'll be putting the link up to that so that you can get the text on that. But anyway, here is, I'll give you the big frame look, and then we'll come closer to show what's at the bottom, which is the meat of the thing. Notice there's a little chart, the thing that says time and an arrow, so that the implication clearly is that the haplotypes and lineages here are older on one side, and as we move towards that E1B, 1A, time is moving forward. But how much time? Does it occur to him? Hi, Ian. Does it occur to him to have like a chronology attached to it? Even his own chronology? Not yet, at least. It's all vacuously generic. And that becomes obvious when you look up the original material. The stuff that he's actually drawing on is from Bergstrom's supplementary material. I'll be putting in a link to the supplemental stuff as well, and that you can get at that by going to the science website, and then you go down and you can download that free. And that's when you discover that that little paper did indeed have this information, which if you oriented it the way Jensen's doing, be along like this. But the point is the chronology along this upper zone here is out to 170,000 years. And when you look at the more detailed haplotype information, that's in an area where we're talking about most of those nodes are appearing in the last 50,000 years, and 50,000 down for the stuff on this side in here, that would eventually bump into that E1 bit. So we're talking about a time frame that's vastly longer than the 6,000 year for the creation of the earth, let alone 4,500 years for the flood, which would be the frame that would be required because all the people on earth are descended not from the population of Adam and Eve, but from the population aboard the ark. And that's a much tighter row to hoe. I'm sure as we get farther on down the road, we're going to start bumping into the parts that Dan Stern Cardinale took notice of, in terms of the fact that he's got haplotypes popping up in Italy during the Middle Ages, when we know by archaeology they belong in the Neolithic. So the chronology is just not matching up in here. So far then, he has dribbled out a few technical papers, and so far is batting 1,000. Every single one of them he's misrepresented. I'm not expecting this to get much better on that. Anyway, Jensen homes in on the E1B1B haplotype as having supposedly, quote, split into several in the AD 300s to 600s, unquote. But this is really refocusing the attention, is that E group apparently originated in Africa tens of thousands of years ago. And I'll be putting a link up to a website that gives one analysis of it, and they're putting up a date of about 47,000 years for that. It's so tight, it's infinitesimally thin. Yes. Yeah, and in fact, all Jensen was doing in his previous book and in the various papers he's done since that Dan Stern Cardinale has taken notice of, and I paid some attention to it too, is he's accepting all the genetic data. He's being okay on that. He, of course, did not generate any of the genetic data. This is stuff that is from these various science papers. But he's simply taking that frame and going, squeezing it down into that 4,500 year frame, which is going to be amusing indeed. Now, I hope you have a lot of fun with all of that technical paper stuff, and you learn so many wonderful new things reading the material that's being misrepresented by the creationists. The other part of the show, they're back. I'd planned on talking about a different subject, which will be into next week for part 2. But what popped up immediately into my head was the fact that in the state of West Virginia, a bill has passed their Senate there, sponsored by Senators Amy Grady and Jan Taylor, which is about allowing teaching of intelligent design in their public schools. Isn't that precious? It's not an immensely long bit. In fact, this is it. It's really short. And I'll be putting a link up to that as well. And tracing down where all of this came from is kind of funky. First of all, it's extremely generically worded. It allows schools, quote, to teach intelligent design as a theory of how the universe and or humanity came to exist. So we're going from origins or bust to us with apparently nothing in between, which is entirely consistent with the obsessions of anti-evolutionism, which from the get-go has always been obsessed with us humans and the need for human beings to be specially created. Trilobites and dinosaurs are kind of peripheral little things that they can bother about. And then, of course, they got to have the origins or bust angle. Where did the universe come from? Nothing about chronology or anything. Now, the sponsor of this is apparently not coming from a young Earth creationist perspective. She's thinking in terms of the normal chronology frame. However, that's not necessarily going to help them when it comes to how vaguely worded the thing is, because creationists are able to use that intelligent design trope just as much. Anyway, there's a couple linkages that I'll be putting up to a thing on from Ars Technica on this bill, and another one from West Virginia Public Broadcasting, where they were delving into things and actually interviewing and finding out more about it. And then also a thing from the Real West Virginia that's been covering this. It turns out our dear Senator Grady only came up with this little nugget because a high school student brought it to the need to do this to her attention. And guess where the high school student was getting his information from? Darwin's Doubt from Steve Meyer. So there is where, even though the Discovery Institute steadfastly doesn't want to muddy the waters again because of how they got burned on Dover, nonetheless, the people who read this material are perfectly happy to do it for them. Now, the sponsor of this thinks that the Dover ruling and the various other rulings about teaching creationism in schools from the courts won't apply here because they're not mandating that you teach intelligent design. They're only letting the schools have the option to be able to do so. And by that little maneuver, we'll get around that. Nick Matsky was calling attention to this and indicating that they're going to have to get over that legal hurdle of Dover. And I'm saying, yes, but we're in the Trump court era. And what worries me is the idea that this thing might get bumped up as a test case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court may decide, those culture camp conservatives on there, might decide to dust off Antonin Scalia's dissent from Edwards v. Aguilar, which, by the way, is a decade after Roe v. Wade in the 1980s, and decide that Edwards v. Aguilar, that forbade creation science to be taught in the schools, was incorrectly decided, just as they decided Roe v. Wade was incorrectly decided, and not only opening the floodgates for intelligent design, but for full-out young Earth creationism. And do I have any great hopes that the scientific illiterates on the court will be able to figure out the difference in this? I don't think so. So we'll find out. It could be, it would be particularly disconcerting, but not at all surprising. We're up for grabs. The Federalist Society has bought and paid for the best court they could ever hope for to be able to do this kind of stuff. And fasten your seatbelts, kids. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see whether or not any other states follow through on. So there's a couple other states. To some extent, there's always a small coterie of creationists in varying states that churn out. They'll come in every single year and put a bill up, and it never gets through committee. But this one managed to get passed by this West Virginia Senate. So we'll see how this matter goes. I would love to have had more methods questions asked of the various senators on there. Oh, and an interesting feature, although this thing passed like 27-6. But what intrigued me about it was I also looked up who did it. And if you go to the West Virginia Senate, you can find out all of their little folk who are in the Senate. And then I marked down who voted for what and all the rest. It will not surprise you that every single one of the people who voted for it was a Republican. Of course, there are not a hell of a lot of Democrats in the West Virginia Senate. But what's interesting about it is that there were Republicans in the West Virginia Senate who voted against this, because there's only there's only three Democrats in the Senate. And so the other three votes were from Republicans who were going, no. So whether or not they stay Republicans or whether the Trumpistas will allow them to stay Republicans, we'll find out. It's going to be an interesting little thing to deal with. So, yep, they're back. And it's going to be an interesting period to deal with. The data, of course, won't change at all. And the human evolution section is going to be given a big treatment in Rocks for There Volume 2. We keep on getting new relevant information on this. Gunter Beckley has been tiptoeing into the evolution biz and trying to revive claptrap arguments about Lucy, Australopithecines, and all the rest that I bumped into because Dave Farina had criticized Beckley as part of his criticism of the Discovery Institute. And my co-author, Jackson Wheat, is collaborating with Farina on the content for a follow-up video on the human evolution issue as seen in the world of Gunter Beckley, who, by the way, of course, is not an anthropologist. I was coming up with my own analysis independently of where it's looking like Beckley is doing a lot of rather shady authority quoting and quotation out of context. Certainly he's quotation out of context, or he doesn't understand the significance of it in relation to these Miocene hominid footprints and things that are found in Crete, in the Greek area, that are fascinating for the spread of how far the various hominids were going in Eurasia before the advent of our species, but it doesn't make Australopithecines go away. And it's going to be an interesting little thing. I'll be very anxious to see Jackson and Farina's analysis. And Beckley, of course, had a hissy fit on the earlier one that Farina did, because he just dumped on him with a bunch of posts that are showing that Beckley is no different and no more adroit than Casey Luskin. Luskin, of course, is back at the Discovery Institute, although not quite as prolifically posting as he was before. And now that some of the, I think they culled some of their listings as to who was following them online, because I used to get posts from the Discovery Institute from their various thing at Evolution News, and that stopped. Whereas CMI and that they still are not quite so fussy about having the heathens following them on that. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting thing to pull together all the various information. We'll be getting Gutsick Gibbons content as well on this, because she, of course, is a physical anthropologist, so she is knee deep in the forensics of the matter, and of course the science literature keeps marching on in terms of the information in here. One of these days, it'll be fun to see whether Beckley can ever get to the point of figuring out what the hell he thinks happens. And I'm still waiting for the damn whale paper. That's now been quite a few years that it was just pending, according to when he was discussing that with Erica, but I haven't seen hide nor hair of it. And I'll be intrigued to see if that ever materializes in the same way that von Sternberg, who has been kind of the point person in lectures on the supposed impossibility of whale evolution. I want to see the technical sources to see just exactly what argument are they trying to make. We're going to have a whole section on whales, by the way, in Rocks 2 as well. So I'm just waiting with bated breath or bated blowhole, if we want to look at it that way. To see what all they deal with and try to tell the difference between a creationist claim about the whales and an intelligent design claim about the whales. So anyway, so how is everybody doing out there in the wonderful world of weather gone crazy? We've gotten a little bit of a cold snap here and a little bit of light snow we had a couple days ago, but then a Chinook wind came along and melted a lot of it off, but nothing at all like the mess that's going on in the eastern part of the United States. So glad I'm not there. And then we've all got the details to deal with in terms of the economy and the world in general and all of that. So we'll be keeping our little eyeballs peeled for that. And a little shout out to Dapper Dino and the bunch that were together down there in the Grand Canyon a ways back. That I have been following through on my promise to revise my Politique game and improve it to a new Mark III version. I'll probably have to buy a bunch of blank cards and that to make up new game cards and that, because I'm adding on some components on that that really justify making a complete new set to incorporate a lot of the information and structuring and that I had. And I may even try to find those little adhesive little goo gods and come up with an improved board and all of that that'll take into account a lot of little, I've got like little earthquake faults that are going to be popping up in the structure of it as to where earthquakes happen and all that. So anyway, rough week, but not weather here. Okay. Everybody stay really super duper safe wherever they are, and make sure you got supplies and power doesn't go outage and all that. And we're in not a bad state here in the Pacific Northwest, where at least in my neck of the woods, an awful lot of the power comes from hydroelectric, and it's fairly stable. And although the most severe problems we have in terms of power outages come from wind blowing down transformer connections. And that can happen about practically any time of year, and especially if we get an ice storm, which we have not had in a long time, and hope we don't get another one of those. So anyway, any questions from everybody? We've been on like 20 minutes and that. I got the main shtick in there that everyone can follow up on. Let me see whether or not I missed any details from my little notes in here. Boop, 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 boop. And yep, I think I got everything in. So I may then pull a shorty on you, and hopefully it will be all up to speed in that for next week, when we will return to the normal formatting of that. If anybody wants to start a drinking game as to when in hell will Jensen cite a technical paper and not misrepresent it, because he got upwards about almost 60% of the technical papers that he was drawing on in his previous book, I would classify as misrepresentations or data suppressions. And it's so far, he's running at 100%. So that means he's going to have to actually bump into some information and fairly represent the contents of the papers in order to be able to bring that option down. We'll find out. Okay, so wondering is a third volume on Phineas stuff is in the future. Oh, absolutely. Moi. Not only is it in the future, I am writing it as we speak. Oh, yes, Phileas Fogg of volume 3. One of the reasons why it took so long to do Paralogs 2 is because it's a two-parter. The other half of the tale is in book 3, although each of the novels are completely self-contained. And then I was also writing the 2 books there, Slam Dunk and The Rocks were there during that same period, and plotting out the superstructure for the remaining 10 novels. There's going to be a dozen Paralogs of Fog stories, and I know the whole arc of all the stuff that's going along. So I now have basically an assembly line structure to where I'm tightening up and focusing up the structure for the fourth novel, while I'm now working on the full third novel. And then the plans out for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, with the Foggs and their kids growing up, and the development of the Astronef flying time machine, and all the wonderful little things that are happening as we move through the 19th century and into the 20th century, and the rest of the world starts having automobiles and electric lights, and that, yawn. And wireless telegraphy. So, yeah, it's going to be a delightful adventure. The Paralogs 3 will have a ton of stuff in Paris, because our main protagonists and things involving Monsieur Fortier and Monsieur Valancourt connect up to that. And a little teaser alert, a bunch of Russian jewel thieves and Russian spies and Russian anarchist assassins and all sorts of stuff that's going on, all grounded in a great deal of reality for the period. And in fact, I had to dive in and do a heck of a lot of research on what Paris looked like in 1874, and discovered that, certain boulevards didn't exist yet. The Avenue de l'Opera, that today goes from the Place de l'Opera down to the Tuileries and the Louvre. That was planned as part of the Baron Haussmann's grand scheme, but it bogged down because of the Franco-Prussian War and the like. And so at the time, 1874, it hadn't been built yet. And so it was just buildings and stuff and dirt piles and all that. And during the course of the next 3 or 4 years, it gets built, because I'm pretty sure it was finished in time for the Paris Exposition in 1878. That figures rather deliciously in the tale. We get to see the Statue of Liberty's head, which was on display there. And we get a bunch of cute little things, including solar furnaces with a little bit of a kick to it, and balloon chases, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. So anyway, so indeed, Brian, there is definitely going to be a Phileas Fogg 3. And with a little luck, my plan is that I'll be able to churn out each one of the novels in about 2 years. It took me 6 months to do the first book, and that was a big gush. It took me about 4 months to plan the second novel, but 6 years to actually physically do the bloody thing, for the reasons that I mentioned. But I think I've got my structure and assembly line stuff that I'll be able to get a better measure of it by this winter, when theoretically I should be involving stuff that's going on in riverboats with Russian spies who looked in places they shouldn't have in Blackrock, and will be paying the deadly price for that. And there is a character in the second Fogg novel that is playing, that we saw right in front of us, that figures in the third story. This was a deep setup for the structure of things. And those of you who have read Paralogs 2 can try to guess, it couldn't be that character, could it? Oh, okay, well, we'll see. Anyway, so if I've teased you into wanting to get the novels, I have been sticking the links to the fiction as well as the 2 signs. So the whole oeuvre is available directly through little Amazon on that. And the one you see there is, in fact, the second edition of the first Paralog stories, where I went through and corrected some of the typographical errors and added a few little adjustments in terms of text. So it's a little bit different and tidier, and it has the same graphic format that I used on the second novel. And hopefully I'll continue with that with the subsequent ones. The third novel, by the way, is called Jewels to the Flame. I will type that in there. And then volume 4, the fourth book, is Behold the Gates of Aleph. And this is a setup for a bunch of stuff, which will have a brief meeting with Mark Twain. He pops up in book 4. And there will be farther down the road. I mean, we're going to be connecting up with Nikola Tesla. We got to do that, of course, and mysterious airship sightings in 1897. There's so many things that are going on. anyone that loves the history of the period, hopefully who enjoyed the way I use history in the first two books, will see that I'm doing exactly the same level of neat little Rick Steves goes to the 19th century kind of vivid recreation of places, especially if they're different than what you're expecting, just as Paris of 1874 is different than the Paris of the 20th century, and how it gets from one to the other. We've got so many stuff in London and little, cute little things. And of course, that will be in the subsequent novels. There's going to be wonderful chases on various railroad trains. And of course, we've got to have a thing with Venice, and we have to have some stuff with Monte Carlo. And of course, there would be the occasional flight into space and encounter with aliens. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff in the. Isn't Aleph a Jewish mystic thing? Yeah, well, Aleph is just the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And in transfinite mathematics, Aleph was chosen by Cantor to refer to the infinity sets. And so Aleph null is a standard order infinity, which is equal to the natural counting numbers and or the rational numbers. It's all the same size set. And then Aleph 1 is an uncountable infinity that is the real numbers that includes all of the irrational numbers like pi and square root of 2 and things like that. And how many, whether there are a finite number of infinite sets or not, I think nobody's really worked out. But at any rate, Cantor went nuts contemplating some of these details. And so I've always loved that Aleph imagery. And I had done a draft of a story that is actually going to be reused because it's the superstructure of the last three novels in the Paralogue series. That's I planned to call Gates of Aleph. And so I teased that in the fourth story and use it in a slightly different context, but it's about some of the same things, which is alternate universes and meddling beings from other dimensions and what all that can mean and what how you do it and what kind of energy costs are involved and how that upsets things and so forth. Anyway, so there's lots and lots of teasers of what's going on in the subsequent novels, and I will keep churning them out. And having Fogg and Aouda and the merry little gang having a delightful time doing it. Hopefully everyone will find them as entertaining as the first story, where they're fun to hang out with, as well as going on rip-snorting adventures. So everybody that reads the second novel in that, be sure to review it and tell people about it. And if you are really flushed with dough, buy a copy and donate it to your library. I've donated a copy of each of the two first novels to my local library so people can just read them, even though I would prefer people to buy them because I can use the royalties. But at any rate, I think if there's an infinite set, there must be inference by a set of them. Yeah, it's a deep structure, and I've had more fun when I bump into engineers and people that have kind of fuddy-duddy minds when I inform them that some infinities are bigger than others. I first learned about Cantorian transfinite numbers in a little side lecture that calculus professor gave when my first year in college. So this is about like 1970 or so. And at one point, he stopped and gave a little bit. He was talking about certain boundary layers of mathematics and how you can't do a root formula for a fifth degree polynomial and things like that. And he brought up transfinite numbers and how you count infinite sets and Hilbert Hotel. I'll type that little thing in the little hill. Everyone should know about the Hilbert Hotel. That was another mathematician, and the use of the hotel analogy of a hall with an infinite number of rooms and what happens when new guests show up. And so this is basically how you deal with counting infinite sets. And it's Gödel got involved with the same phenomenon. It's a lot of really neat stuff. And it's a counterpart to the weirdness of quantum theory and the weirdness of relativity theory, that you got all the weirdness of mathematics. And if you are a glutton for punishment, but it's worth the punishment, Gödel, Escher, Bach, the Eternal Golden Braid book that Hofstadter did way back, I don't know, in the 1970s or so. And it's a funky, great big thing. But by all means, it's worth the thing, because you discover bits about iterative math systems and issues about, can an ant colony be a single consciousness? Remember, I mentioned that as coming up in that lecture on ant behavior from just a couple of weeks ago from EWU. So these are all ideas that are knocking around, whether or not DNA is the only probable way that life could develop. Is it the only game in town? Can there be any alternatives to it? It's for a book that's written half a century ago. It's just deliciously thought-provoking and delightful, and you learn about so much fun stuff. And you can read it in practically any order you want because of the way that it's very fractal in and of itself. But I started at the front and worked my way to the back. So Columbiad and my hands needing to, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, Columbia, the gem of the ocean in my hand, need to finish starting reading of it. Yeah. Well, you can go through one little chapter at a time. In both of the books, the initial chapters are quite short. And only as we get deeper into the plot in the second half of the novel, when we get to the meat of the stuff, as the time sense starts dwelling into where a particular chapter might involve stuff that's taking place in great busyness over the course of a few hours, or in the case of the big climactic fight aboard the Helios airship, is taking place in about 10 minutes. And because time travel is involved, it's possible for functionally the entire second half of the second novel takes place within a minute. That the bunch go into the shed at Fairlands, and technically speaking, then at the end of the novel, they come back out a minute later. But months have passed to them, and a lot has happened, including that bullet wound in Auda's arm. She had to make a point not to tell the servants about, because otherwise they would wonder what the hell happened. Anyway, KSP2 won't let me explode more kernels. Anyway, it's you'll continue to find Auda and Fog and that having drollery. In fact, there's another really strong woman character, Rosalind de Andrassy, and pay very close attention to her last name. That if you ferret out some sneaky Pete, that's an Easter egg that will be bearing fruit in subsequent novels, that she is a fictionalized relative of a character of that last name that is not known by that last name in the detective lore fiction. And because Sherlock Holmes is in the tale, we got to have this one too. And so she's a really spunky character, wearing rather racy leather outfits and all the rest, and is not a pushover by any means. And she's got kind of a love-hate relationship with this Major Grant that figures in the second novel. That there's a lot of new characters, and that's coming along. So anyway, I've been having a lot of fun with the thing, and it keeps my one half of my brain busy on one kind of a thing at the same time that I'm working on the material for the new book, and pulling together all the little bits and pieces, making sure that it's really, really, really up to date. We've got, I wanted, as the example of this bit about listing the dates for the flood, is that there's, if too many people, and people can let me know in terms of their own personal experiences that they've had, but in most cases, in an environment like the little school over there, that the church that had Gillis come in and lecture them, that's one teeny little niche of creationism that's filtering down through the people in that group. And they won't necessarily really realize the degree to which the big creationist world is at loggerheads over a lot of different issues, because they tend not to play these up except in little footnotes in the sidebars that pop up, although it's churning along. Like with Ken Ham and his complaints about evolutionary creationists who dare allow too much speciation. And to some extent, I think Ken Ham doesn't even read his own stuff all that closely, so he doesn't realize what's in Answers in Genesis website. In the same way that I don't think he understands what the content of the Creation Museum on the Ark Encounter, where they have material that, if you think about it, Ham doesn't really accept some of the stuff that's in his own museum, but he doesn't get close enough to actually look. So it's a funky little world that's going on in there. I guess he's probably too busy raking in the money and keeping the projects going. Apparently they bought a big defunct car factory or something to act as their institute, and I'm sure there'll be more arrays going on in terms of raising money and all that. So expect the ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching to keep going. even if they don't have a product. Although they do, I have to admit, both the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter have first-class visual displays. I mean, they've got people that do stuff for like theme parks, and they happen to be religious creationists and that, so they're doing this maybe with a extra cut, not having to. Maybe they're doing it all at cost. I don't know. You don't have to know all the oils in your snake to sell it. Yes, indeed. Yeah, especially if you are on a steady keep fill service of snakes. Just as long as there's a steady supply of snakes to come into oil, then you don't have to worry about it. So anyway, that gets you up to speed on that, and also the paralogs. And a little spoiler alert is that I represent the philosophy of a secular, rational mind in the paralogs novels. There is zero supernatural in the tales. And every once in a while, issues of religion and philosophy and that will be coming up naturally in the course of the story. It appeared in the first novel in relation to things like the little astrologer in Yokohama that appeared in the old Jules Verne novel. And we'll be getting more of that. For example, when Sir Hiram Maxim, or eventually Hiram Maxim, he's not a Sir yet, is with our group going down to South Africa in Paralogs 2. And Maxim was quite a critic of missionaries, and particularly what they were doing in China, and wrote a big screed about it during this period. And so you've got an interesting little take as they're happening to be crossing the equator and going to South Africa in Christmas time. And so it's stuff with Christmas carols and all this other stuff that's going on their voyage down to Port Elizabeth. And then the venture into the distant world to get to Lake Fundudzi, where the climax of the novel takes place. So anyway, everybody stay safe. We got 40 minutes in on that, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, everybody.